obviously I drew the short straw. I'm right after lunch, and we're going to be talking about data and privacy. But the good news is we're not going to be talking about all the details of the new state privacy laws that have just passed. We're going to take a slightly different tact to the topic, and we are going to instead talk about the imperative role that data has in the US economy. So one of my goals today is for all of us who have careers that really are grounded in data. So whatever your title is, whether it's marketing, you're in sales, maybe you are a data scientist and you actually have data in your title, all of our careers really are surrounded by data. And what I want us to do is to be able to walk away from the session today with our heads held high, knowing that our roles really do play an important role in the US economy. And you're going to walk away with some statistics on it because we've got a great panel of academics that are going to talk to you about their research. Okay, so in the past couple of years, our industry has been hit by a barrage of negative press. And unfortunately, this loud voice really has been that underlying trend that we believe is pushing what we're seeing with state privacy laws. And in fact, for those of you who are keeping up, I can't keep up anymore, we've had more than 5 new laws that have passed, and I expect by the end of legislative session, we'll have at least another 3. So lots of work ahead of us, and that patchwork continues to build. But the reality is that advertising and data-driven advertising isn't bad. In fact, for consumers, this equals more than 30K in free content for us. And so when we think about the open internet, advertising really drives the ability for the internet to be open and for that information to be at our fingertips. And in fact, 20% of jobs in the US are actually supported by advertising activity. So what I think the general public and many legislators may not recognize is that data really drives more than just advertising, and the benefit of advertising is more than just the benefit of selling goods and services or return on investment on ad spend. So, since we have several professors that will be joining us on stage, I'm going to take us all back a little bit to our Marketing 101 classes in college and talk to you about the 4 Ps of marketing. So again, I think general public and legislators often think data is just driving advertising. And it is, and it's important. But when we think about marketing, marketing is more than just advertising. It also includes price, product, and placement decisions. And so as I bring the panel up today, we're going to be bringing experts up that are going to delve into each one of these topics in more detail. And so with that very brief intro, I'm going to have my panelists join me on stage, and then I'll do a quick intro. Come on up. Yes, you can all sit. So we have Dr. Howard Beales, Emeritus Professor of Strategic Management and Public Policy from the George Washington University. And then we have Niels Wernerfeldt. He is an Assistant Professor of Marketing at the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern. And then we have J.P. Dubé. Close? Okay. He is a professor at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. So thank you all for joining me. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So Howard, I'm going to put you on deck first. Since your research paper titled An Information Economy Without Data was the inspiration for our panel, I'm going to go ahead and put you on deck first here, as I mentioned. So based upon your research, what was one of the most surprising benefits of data-driven marketing that you have uncovered?
I'm not sure it's surprising to me because I've studied advertising for a long time, but it was certainly surprising to policymakers and to privacy advocates is the whole notion that advertising is actually a good thing. It's not harmful to consumers. It is useful to consumers in really important ways. It makes markets more competitive. It makes prices lower. And in many markets, it leads to more innovation and actually improves consumer health. In the 1980s, Kellogg started advertising the benefits of diets high in fiber to reduce the risk of some kinds of cancer. Flatly illegal, in clear violation of the Food and Drug Administration regulations. But the National Cancer Institute liked the idea of getting that information out there because it had been there for years and nothing was happening in those markets and nothing was happening with American diets. But once advertising started, and the Federal Trade Commission, where I was at the time, started defending Kellogg for running that advertising, you started to see change in the cereal market. Fiber content of cereals went up, fiber content of diets went up. That advertising spread to the relationship between fat composition and heart disease. Saturated fat consumption fell, heart disease fell. Significant health benefits that came from disseminating information to consumers as a result of that advertising. And the third aspect of that that's often surprising to many is it narrowed demographic disparities. In fiber, for example, before the advertising, you saw much higher fiber consumption levels among whites than blacks, and much higher fiber consumption levels among two-parent households than among single-parent households. Those differences all narrowed as a result of advertising that told everybody, and not just those who read official government publications.
I know this is Howard's question, Christine, but I'm just going to chime in. Before coming to Kellogg, I worked at Meta for several years, and one of the biggest surprises of me from my time there was during the pandemic, we actually saw nearly every government, NGOs from nearly every country start to advertise on Facebook. So the pandemic was happening, they need to come out and reach people, tell them this is how you get vaccinated, these are the current regulations, and they turned to online advertising, they turned to using a lot of this data and this sort of narrative of surveillance capitalism, of data extraction from users. Well, this actually led to millions of people getting vaccinated, saving millions of lives. And so I think the discussion is much more nuanced, and the consumer benefit often gets lost in the discussion.
Mm-hmm. Very true. So one of the basic tenets of what makes the U.S. economy work is competition. So kind of going back to the 4 Ps of marketing, what I wanted to do is just speak to a little bit of what I saw on the FTC website about competition. And honestly, I didn't make this up. Here's the full quote. Competition in America is about price, selection, and service. It benefits consumers by keeping prices low and the quality and choices of goods and services high. Competition makes our economy work. So this isn't me saying it, it's not the panel saying it is the FTC saying it, and it plays right into what we think about data and how it drives those 4 Ps of marketing. So Nils, as it relates to specifically small advertisers, what role has consumer data played in their ability to compete with larger brands?
So when you look at academic studies across several of these platforms, if this is Facebook, Google, Wayfair, other places, a pattern that emerges time and again is that personalization actually benefits the smaller players more. So if you look at advertisers who are just starting out, advertisers who haven't spent a lot of money, advertisers who are selling niche products, these are the guys that actually reap most of the benefits from using data. So one study I did, we experimented on about 70,000 advertisers at Facebook. This was a pretty representative sample. We measured how effective their ads are today and how effective would they be if they lost third-party cookies. And first of all, you see that third-party cookies are just massively important for advertising effectiveness. But the second thing you see is that small guys, the guys who just started on the platform, who are below median ad spend, it hurts them about 5 times as much. So if you think about potential entry into markets, new products being created and entering markets, that I think is where a lot of the data is most valuable. I want to caveat this by saying, when you run experiments on platforms, you only observe the data that the platform has. So on Facebook, you only observe ad spend, how long they've been around, potentially industry. You don't actually know how many employees they have or what their revenue is. So I have an ongoing paper with someone from a kind of lower tier institution in Hyde Park, where we're looking at we ran a survey of about 10,000 advertisers, and we asked them, like, how big are you? How many employees do you have? And then we experimented to measure how effective their ads are. And so I think in about a year, in this conference next year, JP and I can tell you about, small businesses, exactly how effective this advertising is, what is working, what isn't. But I think the early evidence suggests that this data is just very important for these small guys.
Absolutely.
There's actually some direct evidence of that from the experience with the GDPR in Europe, where one study found that for large e-commerce sites, revenue was down a little less than 8%. For small e-commerce sites, it was down more than twice that, more than 16%. As a result of the data restrictions. And there's a fascinating study on the Alibaba platform that, again, like you say, is platform specific, but they stopped using personalized information to make recommendations. They had a small sample of 250,000 people in the test group and 250,000 people in the control group. The test group, the 250,000 people, saw about 250,000 products. In the group that used personal information, they saw more than 4 million different products. If you're an entrant, you want to be in the 4 million group, not in the one to a customer group.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, data and personalization is incredibly powerful from a competition standpoint, but also from a pricing standpoint. And so, unfortunately, one of the themes that we have legislators attempt to address in privacy law is the concept of fairness, and often, more times than not, that concept of personalized pricing is attacked and considered discriminatory. So, JP, from your perspective, I'd like you to weigh in on personalized pricing and whether or not you believe it's a tool for fairness or discrimination.
Very well. The concept of personalization is inherently discriminatory in the sense that we're going to be starting to vary how much we charge people based on how much we think they're willing to pay. I think the real question is, what's the objective definition of fairness? I don't think we have an objective definition of fairness. I think even in the public policy circle, the definition of fairness varies depending on what's in our self-interest. But let me ask you the following hypothetical. What's more fair? Is it more fair to charge everyone exactly the same price for a set of features and benefits, and to only make those features and benefits as a result accessible to those who can afford that uniform price? Or is it more fair instead to charge everyone differentially for those features and benefits, but to make everyone get equal or close to equal access to them? I mean, what we're describing here is the latter, the personalization, can be inherently progressive. I mean, this is why our tax scheme, for example, doesn't charge everyone the same marginal tax rate, because it's about access, it's about inclusion, and uniform pricing can be inherently exclusionary. One of my co-authors worked on a study of supermarket pricing, an area I've also done quite a lot of work, and came to the conclusion in the US that if supermarket chains were more granular with their pricing, meaning that they had store-specific pricing, this is a practice called zone pricing, that poor neighborhoods on average would pay 9% lower prices. So and I think that stemming from this misunderstanding and this sort of uneven definition of fairness is just a skepticism that people have about our capitalist market. There's this belief that somehow capitalism is a zero-sum game, but in fact, personalization is a great example of how capitalism can actually lead to Pareto improving outcomes for all. By personalizing the prices, we increase access of features and benefits to those who would otherwise be excluded. That increases value to consumers. Firms at the same time are making more profit because they're actually now serving those markets. As long as people are willing to pay more than the marginal cost, we get a situation where we get global value creation. Firms are better off, consumers better off. That's a win-win.
Absolutely. So just staying on the theme of what maybe legislators get wrong, which could be a very long conversation, but let's just try to ground it in data and data privacy. What other issues do you think they are getting wrong, in specific to how they're actually writing the privacy laws and enforcing them? Any of you can jump in. Howard, do you want to take a first run at it?
Sure. I mean, I think legislators in particular and policymakers more broadly don't understand how rapidly the environment is changing and how quickly it's evolving. They're worried about practices that happened a while ago and that may or may not reflect the current state of affairs, but they're just not aware. and they're not aware of the complexity of the interactions that happen in this ecosystem, all to facilitate competition with the really big guys. Because competition depends on data. Big companies like Google and Facebook have data of their own. If you want to compete, you need to build that data set, and you need to build it by cooperation, by sharing data across different sites. But legislators make this distinction between first-party data, you can have whatever you want and do whatever you want, pretty close, and third-party data where, boy, you really better be careful who you share it with, how you acquire it, when there's no difference at all from a privacy perspective. If we think bad things are going to happen, we should stop anybody from using that data. But there's no difference as to whether you gave it directly to the person who hurt you or they gave it to somebody else who then hurt you. The problem is the same.
Anybody else want to jump in with what legislators are getting wrong?
Sure. I was at a debate last year with the European Commission in Europe over their new Digital Markets Act, which is some very draconian laws that, rather than targeting practices that we might think are unethical or problematic for competition, are instead singling out specific companies. And I think the concern we have with these laws is they're clouding policies to protect consumers with populist messages that single out companies that are currently unpopular with the modal voter. So in Europe, targeting the big digital titans, for example, is a very popular and very receptive message amongst most voters. But if we look at the kinds of privacy laws that are in the Digital Marketing Act, one of the most salient ones would be self-preferencing, that there's a concern that a company like, say, Amazon, uses the data from its platform to analyze what vendors on its platform are doing, and then sells its own private label goods, putting its own horse in the game, and using the data to help promote its private label goods. Like, well, I'm totally fine with the idea that that might be considered unfair or anti-competitive, except normally we would call that retailing. I mean, grocery stores have been doing this for 50 years. I mean, A&P had private labels in the 50s, and those were litigated, and we came to the conclusion that they weren't breaking any laws by doing so. So it's a little strange that somehow when you're Amazon or your market cap is a certain level, suddenly these are a public policy concern. But if you're Safeway or Kroger and your market cap's just low enough that somehow it's okay to self-preference.
I'm sorry. I'm just going to interject, I guess, that I think it's no coincidence that the companies they're going after are American companies, not European ones.
Yes, Carrefour is innocent.
Yeah, I think there's a bit of a sense of a privacy-free lunch where a lot of regulators don't understand just how costly some of these privacy regulations can be. And we've seen, Howard mentioned some of this, but after a lot of these privacy regulations, just massive real effects on companies, GDPR, ATT, CCPA. And I think some of this, it's hard for a lot of regulators to see when a company doesn't exist or to see when products no longer exist on shelves. And, around the ATT announcement, Facebook did this huge campaign to try to say, like, this is going to really hurt advertisers. And the campaign just completely flopped. Like, actually, it backfired on the company. And I think there's a role for people whose lives are supported by this data, the 20% of the U.S. economy, to actually speak up and say, hey, we are really being affected by this. And I think those voices can help push against some of the populist narrative and some of the surveillance capitalism that is driving these inefficient regulations.
I want to play on that a little bit. So if we think about what's happening today, there is this trend to either restrict or eliminate data. So whether that's happening through privacy laws that are happening at the state level, or even what may or may not occur at the federal level at some point in the future. But what I'd like to do is just kind of tap into each of you and have you look into the future. And if that future does not include our ability to use consumer data for personalization across those 4 Ps, right? So thinking advertising and price and place and actual product innovation, what is the consequence? What is that real consequence?
Well, I guess the central 4 conclusions we came to in our paper was revenue for content providers would fall 50 to 70%. It's a huge chunk of the financial support for the free content on the internet. The effects would be disproportionately felt by small advertisers and small publishers, small content providers, not by the big guys. It would further entrench large players in the advertising and marketing ecosystem. I mean, those I think are some of the primary effects.
I think that we have seen a really disruptive force by the access to data and digitization. And to put it in the right context, if you look across the United States, we have Coca-Cola cities and Pepsi cities. We have Folgers cities and Maxwell House cities. We have Yoplait cities and Dannon cities. And what's remarkable about that statement is those were brand leaders 100 years ago, and until the beginning of the 21st century, that dominance persisted. And the only thing Coca-Cola did right was it was the first in the apothecary business, making medicinal beverages, to use mass advertising. And the question is, well, if all they had to do was use mass advertising, how come their dominance persisted? And the answer was they got all the data, they understood demand, and the barrier for another person to come into this market and build a competing brand meant you have to spend hundreds of millions of dollars a year on advertising. And if you look at what happened around 2003 to 2005, all of a sudden we saw a transformation. All these little consumer brands started launching. You'd start off as a .com with a direct-to-consumer business. You do very small targeted advertising using digital media so that instead of a $100 million ad campaign to build your brand, you might be able to do this $300,000. Now you start small, but as you got traction, you get shelf space in stores, and suddenly you get bigger and bigger. And I'll give you an example which comes also directly from my research. In 1999, about 90% of the beer that was sold in the take-home market was pale lager, and you know who sold it. It was Budweiser and Miller. By 2020, 20% of dollar sales in the take-home market for beer are for craft brands. So in less than 20 years, a century of dominance has been completely disrupted. And I think this is largely an artifact of the ability to build brands cheaply and to target your marketing more efficiently. Taking away the data and the access means we go back to our world where we have the same brands dominating for a century and we don't get access to variety and innovation.
I was going to say the beer story, JP. You totally just stole my thunder here. One thing I will add is kind of more on the consumer benefits side. So right now, a large share of people in California who are on food stamps actually heard about it through digital advertising. So Code for America has this program that helps people determine their eligibility and apply for food stamps. They advertise on Facebook and Google and these other platforms. And so I think that's like right there directly, sort of some consumer benefit. We take this data away, consumers are sort of materially less well off. But building on what JP said, it's sort of hard to overstate the pervasive effects of data on the economy, how it affects any supermarket you go into, the products you see on the shelves, how it affects the cars you drive, the homes you live in. And from experiments I did where we'd randomize exposure to ads, we could look at really long-term behavior and how that's shifted by seeing ads. And so it's hard to think of sort of, I think, a more important set of policies to get right than the ones around data access.
So we know that there is a group of consumers, the majority of consumers, in fact, are comfortable with brands using their data for personalization when it's being done in an ethical manner and carefully. But there is a small subset, a little bit of a trend that's out there, where consumers want to own their data and own the monetization of their data. So do you believe that's a trend that we're going to see actually come into fruition, or do you think it's just a dream that will never actually come into existence? So Howard, I'll have you jump in there first.
I think it's more dream than reality, but a lot depends on the policy approach. I think for most, I think you're right. Most consumers are perfectly willing to see their information shared in ways that are potentially useful to them and certainly not harmful. But they don't have a lot at stake. They're not going to spend a lot of time thinking about whether to share their data or whether to not share their data. And so the default rule makes a tremendous amount of difference for questions that aren't worth thinking about or worth the cognitive effort or worth the attention time. to think about. It's the default that's going to control. And in a world that we're in right now that's mostly opt-out, that means data is pretty widely available, and you can use it in a wide variety of ways. If that switches to opt-in, most consumers are not going to consider whether it's worth the trouble to switch back, and to, unless there's some explicit incentive to do so, like a lower price. And a lot of the opt-in proposals say, no, you can't increase the price to people who won't opt in. So in that world, yeah, there's going to be problems of a lack of data, because not enough people are going to be willing to provide it, and the ones who are willing to provide it are likely to be very different than consumers as a whole.
So I interpret the question a little differently. I took the question to be, do we think that consumers would be more willing to share their data if there was an opportunity for them to monetize it? After all, companies get a lot of value out of knowing my personal traits and then marketing to me in a personalized way. How come I don't get a piece of that action, right? And in fact, my answer to you would be, but that already happens. I mean, since the 1980s, the grocery industry has had a deal with us that you can carry a loyalty card, and by carrying the loyalty card, you get access to special discounts and promotions you wouldn't otherwise receive. But in exchange for that, I mean, unless you hadn't thought very carefully about what a loyalty card does, it means that the grocery store now allows them, I'm allowing them with this card, to link all my transactions over time and create a purchase history, which means they can look at me and they can look at Niels, for example, both of us shopping in, let's say, the cereal category, and they can see that Niels is much more likely to switch brands with a moderate price cut. However, for me, it's going to take a bigger price cut, right? Which means that I have a high willingness to pay for my preferred brand. Niels has a lower willingness to pay. And by the way, since the 90s, Humvee has been helping grocery chains create personalized promotions that are given to you in the form of coupons and otherwise. Sometimes they're geographically personalized. Sometimes they're individualized down to the customer. So I guess my answer is we already see that. A loyalty card program is an example of where the consumer gets paid in exchange for allowing the firm to track their data.
Why do you think it's hard for consumers to understand the benefits that they've been getting for probably 80 years now? I think, early 1900s, we started actual segmentation and targeting. So it just seems like consumers truly do not understand that. We do use the one stat all the time about free content, but it doesn't seem to resonate. How can we just, in a very simple way, let legislators and consumers understand the benefits that they're getting from data and what a negative consequence it would be if that were taken away?
I don't know. I mean, there's some survey work that suggests, if not a majority, close to a majority of people do not know that advertising is what pays for most of the internet content. They're just not aware of that connection. They're not aware that that's why they can get free email from a variety of different providers. They just don't understand that connection. And I don't know what to do about that except to tell them, because there's a lot of people saying, wait a minute, you're giving up something for this. Well, yeah, but you're getting something really valuable in return, and that just that needs to be explained to consumers and policymakers repeatedly.
I'd also say consumers have a double standard. As Winston Churchill famously put it, the best argument against a democracy is a 5-minute conversation with a voter, right? We don't make any sense. On the one hand, we vote very strongly in favor of rules that create firewalls so that firms can't track what we're doing with this false belief it protects us. But when we have an emergency, we suddenly expect our firms to be omniscient. I had a senior vice president from MasterCard would always use the example, what happens when your wallet gets stolen on vacation? You call the 1-800 number to get your card canceled and then replaced, and then you find out that you have to make a separate call for each of the 5 cards plus your debit card in your wallet, because the person on the other end of the phone is only authorized to to access your account on that one card. We voted for that rule, right? We wanted financial institutions to have firewalls to protect us, but then when we have an emergency, we expect them to be omniscient, which of course means we expect them to have access to all of our data.
There's this, in academia, there's this thing called the privacy paradox, where you ask people, how much do you value your privacy? And people say just immense values. I really care about this more than anything. and then you say, okay, that's interesting. You know, could I have your contacts for a slice of pizza? And you get everything really quickly. And so I think, you know, this has been an area that is, you know, you really need to look at the behavior, look at the revealed preference, and not rely on survey-based measures sometimes, or some of these sort of more economics-y measures. And I think this relates to what JP was saying earlier. I think some of the anger some regulators feel towards some large players, they end up sort of stacking the deck against sort of using those more reasonable measures.
Thank you, guys.